I never imagined one mistake could shatter my world forever. That night, the house was silent, too silent. When my brother-in-law knocked on my door, swaying and reeking of alcohol, I thought he needed help. But when he pulled me into his arms, calling me by my sister's name, I froze. I should have stopped him. I should have said no. But instead, I let it happen, and nothing was ever the same again. My name is Emily, and I grew up in a quiet, rural town where life was simple and predictable. My parents were humble farmers who taught me the value of hard work and family. But when I turned 18, I left that life behind and moved to the city to attend university. The transition wasn't easy. The noise, the crowds, and the fast-paced lifestyle overwhelmed me. Thankfully, my older sister, Rachel, and her husband, Mark, welcomed me into their home. They lived in a cozy apartment in the heart of the city, and their kindness made the adjustment feel a little less terrifying. Rachel had always been my rock. She was smart, confident, and caring, the kind of woman I hoped to become. Mark, her husband, was charming and attentive, the perfect partner for her. From the moment I arrived, he treated me like family, going out of his way to make me feel comfortable. At first, their relationship seemed perfect. They laughed, teased each other, and shared loving glances that made me feel both envious and hopeful. I admired the way Mark looked at Rachel, the way he made her feel cherished. But as time went on, I started to notice cracks beneath the surface. Rachel often came home late, tired and irritable from work. Mark, on the other hand, seemed restless, always finding reasons to linger in the living room when Rachel went to bed early. I tried not to overthink it. After all, they were married. People have ups and downs, don't they? But deep down, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling growing inside me. Then came that night, the night everything changed. Rachel had gone to bed early, leaving me alone in the living room. I stayed up late, trying to focus on my studies, but my mind wandered. That's when I heard the knock on my door. I never expected to see Mark standing there, his eyes glassy and unfocused. I never expected him to mistake me for Rachel or for what followed to happen. And in that moment, my entire world shattered. The days leading up to that night felt like walking on eggshells. I'd always admired the bond between Rachel and Mark, but recently, I began noticing subtle changes that made me uncomfortable. Mark lingered around me more often, finding excuses to talk or help me with chores. At first, I brushed it off as him being friendly, but as the moments piled up, I started to feel something else, an awareness of his presence that made my heart race. One evening, Rachel was late coming home from work. Mark and I were left alone, and the atmosphere felt heavier than usual. He sat across from me at the dining table, watching me as I nervously picked at my food. "You know, Emily," he said, his voice softer than normal, "you're a lot like Rachel when she was younger." I froze, unsure how to respond. "What do you mean?" He smiled, but there was something about it that didn't feel right. "Just that you're sweet, caring. It's nice having you here." I forced a laugh and quickly changed the subject, but his words stuck with me long after the conversation ended. The tension only grew from there. Mark started finding reasons to touch me, small gestures like brushing my arm when handing me a glass of water or placing his hand on my back as we passed each other in the kitchen. Each time, my body tensed, but I didn't say anything. I didn't want to believe what was happening. Rachel seemed oblivious. She was exhausted most evenings, heading to bed early while Mark stayed up watching TV or scrolling through his phone. I often wondered if she noticed the way he looked at me, but if she did, she never said a word. One night, while Rachel was out with friends, Mark and I ended up watching a movie together. It was innocent enough, or so I thought. Halfway through, he leaned closer, his shoulder brushing against mine. I didn't move away, but my heart pounded. When the movie ended, I stood quickly, pretending I was tired and needed to go to bed. But as I walked to my room, I felt his eyes following me, and my skin prickled under the weight of his gaze. That night, I lay in bed, unable to sleep. I kept replaying every interaction, every glance, and every accidental touch. I told myself I was overreacting, that I was imagining things. But the next night proved I wasn't. Rachel had gone to bed early again, leaving me and Mark alone. I was sitting at my desk, trying to study, when there was a soft knock on my door. I opened it to find Mark standing there. His tie was loose, his shirt wrinkled, and the smell of alcohol filled the air. "Mark?" I asked, already feeling uneasy. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I needed to talk to you," he said, stepping into the room without waiting for an invitation. I backed up, my heart racing. "Is everything okay?" He didn't answer. Instead, he closed the door behind him, and the sound echoed in the small room. I should have told him to leave. I should have shouted for Rachel. But I didn't. And in that moment, everything changed. Mark stood there, leaning against the closed door, his eyes locked on mine. The dim light from my desk lamp cast shadows across his face, but even in the low glow, I could see the glassiness in his eyes. "Mark, you should go to bed," I said softly, my voice trembling. He didn't move. Instead, he took a step closer. "You don't have to be afraid of me, Emily," he said, his voice low and slurred. "I'm not afraid," I lied, backing away until the edge of the desk pressed into my hips. "But Rachel's asleep, and she doesn't need to know," he interrupted. His words hung in the air, thick and heavy. "Mark, stop," I said, but my voice cracked, betraying my fear and something else. He took another step forward, and suddenly, his hands were on my arms. I froze. My mind screamed at me to push him away, to yell, to run, but my body refused to move. Instead, I looked into his eyes and saw something I hadn't noticed before: desperation. It wasn't just lust, it was longing, sadness, and loneliness. And for a fleeting moment, I felt it too. "Do you know how lonely I've been?" he whispered, his breath warm against my cheek. "Rachel doesn't even look at me anymore." "But you do." I shook my head. "That's not true. She loves you." "Maybe," he said, his grip tightening slightly. "But I don't think she wants me anymore. Not like you do." His words hit me like a jolt. Did he think I wanted this? Had I given him a reason to believe that? I opened my mouth to protest, but before I could speak, he leaned in and kissed me. For a moment, time seemed to stop. My heart pounded in my chest, and my mind raced, but I didn't pull away. Instead, I let it happen. I told myself it was the alcohol, that he didn't know what he was doing. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. And worse, I knew I didn't stop him. When he finally pulled back, his eyes searched mine, waiting for a reaction. "We can't," I whispered, but my words lacked conviction. "Why not?" he asked, stepping closer again. "No one has to know." I wanted to scream, to push him out of the room, to end this before it spiraled further. But instead, I let him kiss me again. And this time, I kissed him back. I don't know how long it lasted, but when it was over, I was left breathless and trembling. "Mark, we can't do this," I said again, more firmly this time. He stepped back, his expression clouded with regret and confusion. "I'm sorry," he said, running his hand through his hair. "I shouldn't have." But before he could finish, we heard a noise outside the room, a soft creak, like the floorboards shifting under someone's weight. Panic shot through me. "Rachel?" I whispered. Mark's eyes widened, and he backed toward the door. "I need to go," he said quickly, his voice barely above a whisper. And just like that, he was gone, leaving me alone in the suffocating silence of my room. I locked the door behind him and sank to the floor, my hands shaking as tears streamed down my face. What had I done? I spent the rest of the night staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. My mind replayed the kiss over and over, filling me with equal parts guilt and longing. I told myself it was a mistake, a moment of weakness that would never happen again. But deep down, I knew it wasn't over. The next morning, I avoided Mark as much as possible, but I could feel his eyes on me whenever Rachel wasn't looking. And despite the guilt eating away at me, part of me didn't want him to stop. The days that followed were unbearable. Every glance Mark and I exchanged felt like a silent confession. Rachel carried on, completely unaware, her laughter and warmth piercing me with guilt I couldn't shake. I tried to act normal, to bury what had happened and convince myself it was a mistake we'd never repeat. But the truth was, the tension between us hadn't faded. If anything, it had grown stronger. Late one evening, Rachel had fallen asleep early again after a long day at work. I stayed in the living room, pretending to read, but my thoughts kept circling back to Mark, his touch, his kiss, and the way his eyes lingered on me when no one else was watching. The house was quiet when I finally got up to go to my room. But as I reached the hallway, I stopped. Mark was standing there, leaning against the wall, his eyes dark and heavy. "What are you doing?" I whispered, my heart pounding. "I need to talk to you," he said, his voice low but steady. I shook my head. "Not here. Not now." But he didn't listen. He stepped closer, and before I could stop him, his hand was on my arm, pulling me gently toward him. "Please, Emily," he whispered. "I can't stop thinking about you." My breath caught, and I froze. "Mark, we can't do this." "Rachel. She doesn't care about me anymore," he interrupted. "You saw it. You've seen how distant she is." I wanted to argue, to tell him he was wrong, but the truth was, I'd seen it too. And that was the excuse I clung to, the justification that let me close the distance between us instead of pulling away. He kissed me again, and this time, I didn't resist. But as his hands moved over me, I suddenly heard it, the sharp creak of a door opening. We both froze. "Mark!" Rachel's voice called from down the hall. Panic shot through me as I pushed him away. "Go!" I hissed, shoving him toward the stairs. He hesitated, but then he turned and disappeared just as Rachel rounded the corner. "Emily," she said, her voice laced with sleep. "What's going on?" I forced a smile, hoping she couldn't see the panic in my eyes. "Nothing. I just couldn't sleep." She frowned, glancing down the hall. "Was that Mark?" I thought I heard someone. "No," I lied quickly. "It was probably just the wind." Rachel didn't look convinced, but she didn't push it. Instead, she yawned and rubbed her eyes. "Well, try to get some rest. Good night." As she walked back to her room, I leaned against the wall, struggling to catch my breath. But the worst was yet to come. The next morning, Rachel left early for work, leaving Mark and me alone. I avoided him as much as possible, but he cornered me in the kitchen. "We need to talk," he said. "No, we don't," I snapped, my voice trembling. "Last night was too close. This has to stop." He reached out, but I stepped back. "You don't mean that," he said. "I do," I insisted. "This isn't just wrong, it's dangerous." His face darkened. "You didn't seem to think it was wrong when you kissed me back." Tears burned my eyes. "I made a mistake." "We both did. But I won't ruin Rachel's life because of it." Before he could respond, the front door opened. Rachel was home early. Her footsteps echoed through the house, and my stomach twisted as she entered the kitchen. Her eyes flickered between us, and I knew immediately she sensed something was off. "What's going on?" she asked, her voice sharp. "Nothing," I said too quickly. Rachel's gaze narrowed. "You're lying." Mark tried to step in. "Rachel, calm down." "Don't tell me to calm down," she snapped, her voice trembling. "What's going on between you two?" Silence. And then it happened. Before I could stop myself, tears spilled down my cheeks, and the look on Rachel's face shifted from suspicion to realization. "Oh my God," she whispered, stepping back as if I'd slapped her. "You didn't." I opened my mouth to deny it, but the words wouldn't come. Rachel's eyes filled with tears as she turned to Mark. "How could you?" "Rachel, No," she shouted, her voice breaking. "Don't. I trusted you, I trusted both of you." I reached out, but she flinched away. "Don't touch me," and just like that, it was over. Rachel stormed out of the house, slamming the door behind her. Mark collapsed into a chair, burying his face in his hands. But I didn't stay. I couldn't. I grabbed my things and left, knowing I'd destroyed everything, the trust, the love, and the family I'd once cherished. Rachel didn't come home that night. Or the next. Her absence was louder than any argument could have been. The house felt heavier, like the walls themselves were suffocating me under the weight of guilt and regret. Mark barely spoke. He sat in the living room, staring at the floor, a drink in his hand. I wanted to hate him, to blame him for everything, but I knew better. I wasn't innocent. I had let it happen. I tried to call Rachel, but she didn't answer. I texted her apologizing, begging her to come home so we could talk, but every message was met with silence. The days blurred into one another. I stayed in my room most of the time, avoiding Mark and the painful reminders of what I had done. I kept expecting Rachel to come storming through the door, demanding explanations or screaming accusations, but she didn't. And then, a week later, it happened. The front door opened, and Rachel walked in. Her eyes were red and puffy, but her face was set in stone. "Rachel," I started, my voice trembling, but she raised a hand to stop me. "Don't," she said coldly. "I'm not here to talk." She turned to Mark. "I'm here to pack my things." "Wait," Mark said, standing up. "Rachel, please." I said don't, she snapped, her voice breaking. "You don't get to beg. Not after what you did." I stepped forward. "Rachel, it wasn't what you think. It just happened. We didn't mean for it to." "Oh, spare me," she cut me off, her eyes blazing. "You didn't mean for it to happen? That's your excuse? You expect me to believe this was just some accident?" I opened my mouth, but the words wouldn't come. Rachel's voice cracked. "I trusted you, Emily. I let you live here. I treated you like family, and this is how you repay me." Tears poured down my face. "I'm so sorry. Please, Rachel, No," she said firmly. "You don't get to apologize. You don't get to fix this." She turned back to Mark. "And you're worse. You were supposed to love me, protect me, and instead, you threw it all away for this." Mark looked like he wanted to argue, but he didn't. Instead, he hung his head, shame written all over his face. Rachel shook her head. "I can't even look at either of you." She disappeared into the bedroom and began throwing her things into a suitcase. I stood frozen in the hallway, unsure of what to do or say. Mark tried to follow her, but she slammed the door in his face. When she finally emerged, suitcase in hand, she didn't say another word. She walked right past us and out the door. And just like that, she was gone. The silence that followed was unbearable. Mark and I didn't speak. We didn't even look at each other. But the damage was done. Rachel cut me out of her life completely. She blocked my number, deleted me from social media, and refused to see me. I tried showing up at her workplace once, but she had security escort me out. The shame ate away at me. I couldn't escape it, not in that house, not in the city. So I left. I packed my bags and moved into a small studio apartment across town, far enough away that I wouldn't have to risk running into Rachel. But even with the distance, the guilt didn't fade. Every night, I replayed that moment, the knock on my door, the kiss, the lies, and hated myself a little more. Mark tried reaching out a few times, but I ignored him. Whatever we had shared, whatever it was that had drawn us together, was a mistake. A weakness. And I couldn't let it define me. I threw myself into school, focusing on my studies and pretending that if I just worked hard enough, I could bury the past. But the truth is, you can't outrun your mistakes. Rachel's absence left a hole in my life that nothing could fill. She was more than my sister, she was my best friend, my family. And I had betrayed her in the worst way possible. I wanted to move forward, to find peace, but the shame never fully went away. And Mark? I never saw him again. I don't know if he and Rachel ever spoke after that day, but part of me hopes he tried to fix things, to make amends in ways I never could. As for me, I learned the hard way that trust, once broken, can never truly be repaired. Months passed, but the guilt never left me. It lingered like a shadow, a constant reminder of the night I made the biggest mistake of my life. No matter how much I tried to move on, Rachel's absence was a hole that couldn't be filled. I replayed that moment over and over, wondering what I could have done differently, where I could have stopped it before it spiraled out of control. But no amount of regret could change the past. I tried reaching out to Rachel again, writing letters and emails that she never responded to. I even sent gifts for her birthday, hoping she'd see them as peace offerings. But everything I sent came back unopened. Mark disappeared from my life completely, and I was grateful for that. Seeing him again would have made it impossible to move forward. Therapy became my lifeline. I needed to understand why I had let myself cross that line, why I hadn't stopped him. My therapist helped me see that it wasn't just about Mark. It was about me, my insecurities, my loneliness, and my need for validation. Rachel and Mark had a relationship I admired, but I also envied it. I wanted what they had: love, security, and passion. And in a moment of weakness, I let myself believe that what Mark offered was real. But it wasn't. What I mistook for connection was desperation, his and mine. We were both vulnerable, both searching for something we thought we'd lost. But instead of finding comfort, we destroyed everything. One of the hardest lessons I learned was that forgiveness isn't always possible. I wanted Rachel to forgive me. I wanted her to see how sorry I was and to let me back into her life. But she didn't owe me that. And eventually, I had to forgive myself. I had to accept that I couldn't undo the past, but I could learn from it. I could be better, stronger. I could make sure I never let loneliness or insecurity push me to betray someone I loved again. I focused on rebuilding my life, not to erase what happened, but to make sure it never happened again. I found new friends, threw myself into my studies, and started volunteering at a local shelter. Slowly, I began to feel like myself again, not the girl who made a terrible mistake, but someone who was learning to grow from it. Rachel and I never reconciled. The last time I saw her was a chance encounter at a coffee shop months later. She looked happy, surrounded by friends, and she didn't see me. I wanted to go up to her, to beg her one more time for forgiveness. But I didn't. Instead, I let her go. Some mistakes leave scars, and some relationships can't be repaired. But that doesn't mean you stop trying to be better. To anyone who has ever made a mistake they regret, I want you to know this: you can't change what's already done. But you can change what comes next. You can learn from it. You can grow. And you can choose never to let it define you. Because forgiveness doesn't always come from others. Sometimes, the hardest person to forgive is yourself. What would you have done in Emily's situation? Could you live with the guilt, or would you risk everything to seek forgiveness? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I want to hear your perspective on this heartbreaking story. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more shocking and emotional stories like this one. And stay tuned, our next story will leave you speechless.